everybody! Welcome back to Fiddle and Fables. For the first video in my violin tips series, we're going to get into how to care for your violin. So if you are a first-time violinist or violin student, you may not know very much about the violin when you first start. I work at a violin shop, and one of the most common questions we get is, what do I do with this? How do I make sure that nothing happens to it? How do I take care of it? So we're going to get into a couple of different topics about how to keep your violin in good condition and things that you need to do every single time you play. The first topic that we're going to cover is how temperature and humidity can affect your instrument and how important it is that you keep those things stable. The temperature and humidity that your violin is stored at can actually have a huge effect on your instrument. So let's talk about how to store it properly. Number one rule, always keep it inside. In a car, the temperature fluctuates and you tend to get extremes, either really cold or really hot. Neither of those is good for your violin, and let me tell you why. In the case of heat, your violin is actually put together with something called hide glue in these seams, the top and the back, and all of the pieces that are glued on are attached with hide glue. Hide glue melts in heat. So say you leave your violin in the car in the summer because nobody told you, you didn't know any better. This is what's gonna happen. You're gonna come back and it's gonna be wide open because that glue will melt right off. So that's why it's important not to let your violin get too hot. Too cold can also be really bad for your instrument as well, and that is because wood, which the whole violin is pretty much made out of wood, expands and contracts in different temperatures and humidities. So when it gets cold and dry, like it usually does in the winter, the wood actually shrinks. And if you look inside a violin, you have to peer through the F-hole. I can't really show it on camera. But there's this little post in there called a sound post. And if the wood on the back and the front of your violin shrinks and contracts and gets really tight and that sound post doesn't shrink as much, this is what can happen. You can end up with a big old crack going right down the front or the back of your instrument. And unfortunately, if you get that, it's a really hard repair and a really expensive one, and you can't just leave it be. Cracks like that will unfortunately only get worse with time. So that's why you should never leave your violin in a car or anywhere outside exposed to the elements where it can get too cold or too hot. Humidity is also really important for violins, and that also has a little bit to do with that last crack that I just showed you. So your violin should be at a pretty moderate humidity, usually what you would keep your house at. Now it depends on where you live because some climates can be much drier or much more humid than others. Where I am on the East Coast, we have really humid summers, so I don't have to worry about my violin getting too dry in the summer. I don't have to do anything to it. In the winter, however, when you're running your heat, it dries your house out. If you live somewhere cold, even if the weather outside isn't that humid, your house will be drier than the outside humidity. So sometimes in the winter, you may need to humidify your instrument, either keep it in the room with a room humidifier, or you can get a case humidifier. I'll show you the kind that I have. So this is the type of case humidifier that I have. It's just this little box, and you open it up, and how it works is it has these little pouches inside, and you put this pouch in a cup of water and let it soak, and when it's filled up, you just dry off the outside, stick it back in the case, and they usually come with a little Velcro piece to stick inside your violin case. That will keep your violin nice and humid. A lot of violin cases also come with a little hygrometer to tell you how humid the case is inside. For your information, usually 40% to 60% is perfect for a violin. Before we move on, I'll just tell you a couple of the signs that you will start to notice if your violin gets too dry. A lot of times in the winter at the shop I work at, we have a lot of people come in with their instruments and they say they just keep going out of tune, the pegs keep slipping, and that's totally normal. It just means the instrument is a little bit too dry. When the wood starts to contract because it's dry, these pegs start to slip. So you'll open up your case one day and your strings will just be loose. That doesn't mean they're broken. You just have to look carefully down here at the peg box and you'll notice that they're just unraveled. The peg just slipped from where it was stuck there in the peg box, and all you have to do is tighten it back up again. But that can be a sign that it's time to get a case humidifier. Let's talk about some simple things you can do to make your bow and your violin last longer. Let's start with the bow. So the hair on the bow is real horsehair. You should avoid touching the hair with your fingers because the oils on our skin can actually take the rosin off of the bow and keep the hair from taking rosin in the future. This is important because the rosin is what makes the bow create sound. If you play on a violin with a bow that doesn't have rosin on it, it's not going to make any sound. The reason is the rosin is sticky. It's made out of tree sap. Here's my cake of rosin. So a question I get asked a lot is, how often do you rosin? And how much rosin should I put on the bow? And the question of how much rosin is something that you'll kind of get used to as you get used to the instrument, but I'll show you what I do just for reference. It also does depend on the type of rosin you're using. In general, you just want to scrub the rosin up and down the hair of the bow, just like that. The reason I say it depends on the type of rosin that you have is because basic student rosin and cheaper rosins don't necessarily stay on the bow as long as more expensive rosins. So if you get a basic student rosin, I would recommend rosining probably every time you play or every other time you play. And if you get more expensive rosin, you may be able to go more like a week without rosining. The other tip I have for you about the bow is going to be about tightening and loosening. So this little screw at the bottom of the bow tightens the hair or loosens the hair depending on which way you turn it. When you play, you should have the bow look about like this. You still want a little bit of a concave curve in the stick at all times. But when you press down on the strings, you don't want the hair to touch the stick. In the same way, you want to make sure that you loosen the bow when you put it back in the case. What happens if you leave your bow tight all the time is that eventually the hair stretches out and you won't be able to get it tight enough to play with it anymore. And you'll have to either replace your bow or get the hair replaced. So when you put it away, make sure the hair is nice and loose, just like that. The most important general at-home maintenance tips I can give you for your violin also have to do with rosin. So when you play, you're going to get a little bit of buildup of rosin on your strings and right here under the strings on your violin. Like I said before, rosin is really sticky. So if you don't wipe that stuff off and you let it sit there, it won't ever come off. So every time you play, take a soft cloth and just wipe your strings and under the strings and even your fingerboard right here. Anywhere where you see that white powder, just dust it off. That's going to keep the varnish of your violin in really good condition. It's going to keep it nice and shiny so that it doesn't have any sticky residue on it from your rosin. It's also going to help your strings last longer. This is kind of an optional bit of maintenance, but I like doing it and it's good for your instrument. So I use this violin polish every once in a while to polish the body of my instrument. You're only going to use it on the spruce and maple parts of your violin. You're not going to use it on the ebony. So just the top and the back. And make sure if you do get instrument polish that you're getting something specifically for violins and string instruments, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong with using the wrong type of polish. There's polish you can get for brass instruments and woodwind instruments, That's not the same stuff, and you definitely don't want to use that on this. So make sure you're getting a polish that's specifically meant for this type of instrument. Now let's talk about the periodic maintenance that you'll need to have done to your violin and bow just to keep everything in good condition and sounding good. So the strings on your violin and the hair on your bow are like the tires on a car. They have to be replaced every so often and they wear out with use. I usually recommend for beginners and students who are just practicing around 30 minutes a day to change the strings and rehair the bow once a year. That usually keeps everything sounding good. Now if you start playing a whole lot more, you're going to start noticing that you need to change the strings and rehair the bow sooner. If you start noticing that your strings sound really dull, and when you press on them, the pitch bends and they go flat, that's usually a sign that the strings need to be replaced. You will also start to see the strings fraying here at the bottom if they're really old. So that's another good sign that you need new strings. On the bow, if you have hair that really needs to be replaced, you'll start noticing that the hair gets thinner. Your bow's been losing some hairs. That's a good sign that you need to get it replaced. And also you can start seeing brown rosin residue down here at the frog if your hair is getting old. That's another good signal that it may be time to get a rehair. I hope that covers everything you need to know if you're just starting violin, and thank you for joining me on Fiddle and Fables.